number 143 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to Standing Order 108 Bracket 2, the committee is meeting to discuss the subject matter of Bill C-69, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on April 16, 2024. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to Standing Order 15.1. Before we begin, I'd like to remind members and others meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. All in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. As indicated in the communique from the Speaker to all members on Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please only use a black approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you're not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout is being adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Thank you for your cooperation. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. We appreciate your understanding in this regard. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So now we will resume debate on the motion of Mr. Turnbull, the amendment of Mr. Hallan, and we have a sub-amendment from Mr. Chambers, yeah, because that changed, right? From Mr. Chambers, MP Chambers, and so the list as I have it here, and it's changed a few times, but I had MP Morantz, I have MP Green, but I don't see MP Green here in the room, so then MP Morantz, then MP Lawrence, and then MP Hallan is the list that I have at this time. So, MP Morantz.
On the list, and we'll pass it along.
I'm going to pass my place to Mr. Davidson.
Okay, so that will go from MP Morantz to, then I've got MP Lawrence.
Just before Mr. Davidson, I just have a brief point of order. Granted, it was very early today, but on today is of course Thursday the 23rd. Earlier today, granted much earlier, at 12:06 a.m., you said we would be meeting tomorrow. Which would be Friday, Mr. Chair. And so I was somewhat surprised that we had a meeting scheduled today. So maybe the chair, I certainly wouldn't be raising a point of privilege out of courtesy to the chair, but perhaps he could just clarify his remarks there.
So we're meeting today on May 23rd, yes. And so thank you, MP Lawrence. So you struck yourself from this, and now MP Hallan?
Move it along.
Well, I've got to just strike the people off till I can get to.
Well, while I have the floor, maybe I'll just point out we got an email from the Translation Bureau Public Service today apologizing for not being able to accommodate until 11:30 p.m. I just wanted to say that they have nothing to apologize for. We appreciate all the incredible work the interpreters do in this place, putting up with many of us. So I don't think that they need anything to apologize for. So I think on behalf of all of us, just wanted to say thank you to all their work and keep up the great work. Okay. And I'll pass the floor.
Well, thank you, MP Hallan. Yeah, and I think that does deserve applause, and we can all get behind our interpreters and do the best we can to make their job easier and to protect their health and safety. So on that, I guess we're going to MP Davidson. Welcome to our committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Happy to be here at Finance. And I think members of this committee will find a story that I have to tell, quite shocking. It's a shocking story for my residents about the rural top-up. I represent the riding of York Simcoe, which is known as the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada, Mr. Chair, and the ice fishing capital of Canada as well, home to the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nations out in the middle of Lake Simcoe. We classify ourselves and always have as rural. And, believe it or not, I was traveling over to Georgina Island, breaking through the ice because we're so rural, you actually have to take a ferry over to Georgina Island. And I stood atop that ferry and took powerful binoculars. It was, Mr. Chair, it was almost like having a telescope, believe it or not. And I could not see the CN Tower. And why does that matter?
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order.
I'm riveted by this intervention. Mr. Davidson is someone I have a great deal of respect for. Love the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada. The Holland Marsh is something I'd love to see on my way up to Wasaga Beach. So with great deal of respect, I would just say perhaps the member should take note of a new feature on most automobiles, which is called lane assist. It kind of bumps you back into your lane. Maybe the chair could bump Mr. Davidson back into his lane, and based on relevance, a point of order on relevance, that maybe he could stick to the actual sub-amendment that's under discussion today.
Just on that point of order.
On the point of on this
Just on
point
the
of
point of
order on
order.
relevance, yes.
I would just ask just a little bit of, you're very gracious with how much latitude you give to everybody. I believe this is Mr. Davidson's first time, and of course, everyone starts off with a preamble. Let's give him a little bit of time, accommodate just a little bit more of latitude, and I know he'll get to his point.
Sure. Thank you, MP Howland and PS Turnbull and MP Davidson. Yes. So just it's on the sub amendment. Okay.
No,
So-
and I
if you could
appreciate
just,
I
try
appreciate
to
the
stick
points,
to that.
and I appreciate technology about lane assist. And the greatest thing about that is we actually have Google, and you should actually Google to go from Georgina Island to our closest hospital. If you walked, and you can Google it, much like lane assist, it takes you 23 hours. So, Mr. Chair, I'm trying to set the stage how rural we are. If you can imagine, to walk to the closest hospital is 23 hours. So why this is all relevant is because York Simcoe has been classified as Toronto. Which, let's think about this for a sec, Mr. Chair, and this is why it's important that we set the stage for members here, and especially people that are watching. We have a First Nations that's currently still on boil water advisory in the middle of Lake Simcoe, and any time.
Point of order. The Liberals promised in 2015 that all boil water advisories would be done in 5 years. So clearly that boil water advisory must be
MP
done.
Lawrence, not a point of order, but yeah, MP Davidson, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And why this is important, again, Mr. Chair, is think about this. The Chippewas of Georgina Island, anytime they have any interaction with the federal government, they are classified as rural and remote. So now we have the First Nations being classified as Toronto, and they do not receive the 20% rural top-up. And back to my colleague's comment, how impressed he is with the Holland Marsh, the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada. This is a farming community, Bradford, West Gwillimbury. I think, Mr. Chair, I currently have a private member's bill, C-280, financial protection for fresh fruit and vegetable growers across Canada. I actually brought fresh fruit and vegetables to the Agriculture Committee to showcase my riding. And I know, the mascot of Bradford, West Gwillimbury is the carrot called Gwilly. And that's how rural York Simcoe is. So this Liberal government has classified York Simcoe as Toronto. And again, it's so important to set the stage. And again, reverting back to the CN Tower, I actually drove down to Toronto, and again, with my powerful binoculars that I would almost classify as a telescope, was up in the CN Tower with perfect visibility, and you could still not see the Chippewas of Georgina Island, the town of Pefferlaw, the town of Sutton. So, Mr. Chair, how does this make sense? So, to bring this back to members, the northern part of the riding, the town of Pefferlaw, we don't receive the rural top-up. So let's have a look at that. Back to my colleague from Whitby about technology. If you were to pull your phone out and try and order an Uber, we have no Uber.
Wow. Doesn't sound very urban.
No, not at all. And, you know, Mr. Chair, we don't have a streetcar. We don't have a subway. People have limited alternatives. And, you know, why that is so important for people to understand. People in my riding that I represent sit and watch on TV when they see the Deputy Prime Minister say, you know, I live in Toronto. I don't even need a car. My dad says I don't need a car. I can just walk out of my condo and get on the subway. We do not have those options in York Simcoe. So I'm trying to make this committee understand the disconnect that the Liberal government has between rural and urban. People want to do the right thing with the environment. People want to do the right thing in my riding. And, you know, we talk about, you know, choices that people can make. One thing in the Holland Marsh, I know my colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge knows this. Oh, he gets so excited about the Holland Marsh, I'm sure he even wants to speak about it. But, Mr. Chair, if you think about this, I've got half the northern part of the riding on propane.
Point of order.
Oh.
Yes. This may or may not be point of order. You can, Chair, you can cut me off, and I'll yield the floor back to the honourable colleague from York Simcoe. And I just couldn't help to notice that he said we all care about the environment. So it'd be great that when the honourable member and the official opposition actually put forth a credible plan on the environment, that'd be wonderful to see. Thank you, Mr.
Chair,
Chair.
this is not a point of order. I have tremendous respect for Mr. Zabera. That is not a point of order.
And
No,
we'll
thank
go
you.
back to MP Davidson.
And you know, that leads to the disconnect talking about this Liberal government after 9 years and not listening to rural residents. It's like you've checked out. And, you know, Mr. Chair, we know now that the shopping cart is the most expensive vehicle in Canada now to operate. I think all members on this committee know that the shopping cart is now the most expensive vehicle in Canada to operate. And, you know, reverting back to doing the right thing on the environment, we have the northern part of the riding on propane. Think about Canada. Think about the money that we send to the Asian Infrastructure Bank. My residents in York Simcoe come to me and say, Scott, I can't even get natural gas to my barn because I'm stuck on propane. I want to lower my costs and hire more people, but I can't even get natural gas lines. You know, my honorable colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge, we talk about solutions. This is one solution. I think we could all agree in the room, I would hope, that natural gas can be a bridge fuel as an alternative in the short term. So people aren't spending double the money and double the emissions with propane. But in York Simcoe, we can't even get our natural gas lines. The other part of that is hydro. I have farmers that want to start small businesses, small canning operations. We are stuck with old phase one infrastructure. So these are the things that are affecting my residents, the residents of York Simcoe, that I'm here to stand up for. And, you know, coming back to the budget, Mr. Chair, I have to, you know, speak to my hometown of Georgina. So walking through this, we're talking about the rural top-up that were denied. We're talking about old age infrastructure that's not happening. I mean, I haven't even got to the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund. That's a whole nother apple cart, so to speak. And no, this, you know, that's a promise that the Deputy Prime Minister actually made in the 2019 election. She stood on the shores of Lake Simcoe and promised, Mr. Chair, $40 million in the budget. Think about that. After 9 years, we are still waiting. Still waiting. So talking about action on the environment. But let's talk about another thing. The Housing Accelerator Fund. You know, Mr. Chair, I think my colleague knows from Vaughan Woodbridge that I am a York Region MP. And, you know, I would say one of two Conservative MPs in York Region. You know, it was interesting to me when I was on the Infrastructure Committee when I first got elected, Mr. Chair, the riding of York Simcoe received less money than any Liberal riding in all of York Region, which we'll get to that. But, you know, I'm going to read this letter of March 5th from one of my mayors. And I told her I would read this, Mr. Chair. To Scott Davidson. On February 28th, 2024, the town of Georgina was notified that her application to the Housing Accelerator Fund was declined. Town staff, including senior leadership, spent considerable time on the application over the summer of 2023. We received guidance from the CMHC on the merits of our application and scored highly based on the application guidelines. Like many municipalities, the town of Georgina is a lean organization facing many priorities and challenges. From a recent announcement, we learned that there was 544 applications to the Housing Accelerator Fund and only 179 were selected for the funding, asking municipalities to dedicate significant resources to prepare this complex application, littered with red tape, with a low chance of success, would seem not to be in the public interest. We have seen recent announcements about municipalities of comparable size to Georgina receiving funding, and notice many similarities between the actions they propose and the ones we propose in our application. Based on all publicly available data, we believe our application was exceptionally competitive and deserving of funding. At the same time, the CMHC let us know that they are not allowed. Now this, let's reread that. At the same time, the CMHC has let us know that they are not allowed to discuss any individual scores or any assessment details of our application, preventing us from understanding where our application fell short. Without any of this information, we are unable to conclude whether the funding decision was actually entirely merit-based. And without this funding, our municipality will have to find other sources of funding to enable the provision of this critical housing supply, placing a further financial burden on our local government. Scott, I would like to ask the federal government to respond how they will be supporting municipalities that submitted competitive applications but did not receive funding. I am also requesting a meeting with the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure, and Communities to discuss our concerns. Thank you, Mayor Margaret Quirk, Town of Georgina. You know, Mr. Chair, I received that letter. Unfortunately, was I surprised? No. But I think what would be surprising to the members of this committee, and myself being a York Region MP, and you know, I'd ask you this, Mr. Chair, I'm sure you can't answer, not because you don't want to, it's probably not permitted as I'm a first timer on this committee, but do you know, as per Stats Canada, the highest growing area in all of Canada? You know, my colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge, I'm sure would want to, suggest that it would be Vaughan. But shockingly, and probably shockingly to everyone in this committee, as per Stats Canada, it is actually East Gwillimbury in my riding. So I received this letter from the Town of Georgina on the Housing Accelerator Fund. And I think it's important for people in this committee to understand where we are in Canada with infrastructure and wastewater. I have a nursing home in York Simcoe that is tired and aged, and the province has stepped up with the operators to build a new nursing home. They have to transfer the water and sewer allocations from the existing nursing home to the new nursing home. And that old nursing home is going to sit vacant. Vacant. There's nothing we can do because there is no more water and sewer allocations. And, why does that trouble people in my community? Because when they see this federal government paying exorbitant amounts of interest now because of their failure to secure low interest rates, there's a day of reckoning that comes. And people in my community know that the budget doesn't balance itself. So just to recap where we are right now about the rural top-up, about the propane, about aged hydro infrastructure. And now we look at the Housing Accelerator Fund. I think members of this committee are starting to get the picture how the people in York Simcoe are actually on the outside looking in. So shockingly enough, and I'm sure shocking to my colleague from Vaughan Woodbridge, because this was actually shocking to me, was the mayor of East Gwillimbury. So first we have the mayor of Georgina. The mayor of East Gwillimbury applied for the Housing Accelerator Fund too.
I'm sure they got it, right?
No. That.
Wow.
So I've got three big areas in York Simcoe, being Georgina, East Gwillimbury, Bradford, West Gwillimbury. And again, Mr. Chair, the fastest growing area in Canada. After I received that phone call, I preemptively said, I've got to call the mayor of Bradford, West Gwillimbury, because I said, surely we can't go 3-0. There's no possible way. My small towns, given the wastewater, the situations where they're at, there's no way Bradford, West Gwillimbury could be denied the Housing Accelerator Fund as well. Yeah. Unbelievable, Mr. Chair. Unbelievable. They were denied as well.
Wow.
3 strikes, you're out. Now I'm sitting there. I was actually really, really in shock. the fastest growing communities in Canada all turned down for the Housing Accelerator Fund, Mr. Chair. And again, you know, when I roll back to 2019, looking at York Simcoe and the amount of money that this federal government has spent, York Simcoe is at the bottom of the list. And I think what was more concerning to me when I spoke to the mayors, how much third-party resources and money these towns had to spend on these applications. And I think why that's shocking now, and they explained, Mr. Chair, about the red tape and back to the letter of how involved these applications is, the dedication that people had to put into these applications. You know, at the time, I reflected on, you know, the money I spent on doing a Bear Trust that this government all of a sudden said, we're not going to do that anymore. I'm still not sure who to send the bill to for the $400 for the accountant and other people that have written me on who's going to reimburse that, but that's another story. So again, what's concerning about this, if you look at the Liberal government has increased the federal public service by 40%. You know, honestly, Mr. Chair, ask yourself this. Are Canadians getting 40% better services? Are my municipalities involved in this Housing Accelerator Fund getting better services? Do we want to see our municipalities spending enormous amounts of money on applications? It makes absolutely no sense, Mr. Chair. And again, you know, it's shocking. And, you know, I think to take I take the tact with looking at my community again about the rural top-up. You know, members from the Liberal Party, and I'm sure, Scott, you're talking about the rural top-up. That means, you know, you agree with the carbon tax. No, I don't agree with the carbon tax. Really? No, I do not agree with the carbon tax. We will axe the tax, but I can tell you this, that while I'm the member of Parliament for York Simcoe, I will fight for every nickel that my community deserves. After all, it's their money. And you know, Mr. Chair, again, representing the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada, we can talk about Bill 234. You know, if we look at the...
Point of order, Chair. With all due respect,
Yes,
Chair, based on relevance, I would really encourage or ask you if you wouldn't mind encouraging the member to get back to what the topic at hand is, which is a debate on a sub-amendment that was proposed by the Conservatives that I don't hear any relevance in. You know, I'm stretching, I'm listening
On that point
intently and really want to see the relevance. So maybe Mr. Davidson could bring it back around and actually relate it to the sub-amendment at
Thank
some
you.
point.
P.S. Turnbull on relevance.
On that
MP
point of
Howell.
order, I don't want to put words in my great colleague Scott Davidson's mouth, but I do understand that so far everyone's interventions have had discussions on what the budget does and doesn't have in it, and I think because we're talking about the carbon tax scam, it is mentioned inside the budget, and it's just something that Mr. Davidson didn't see. I will remind everyone that it was one of our demands for the budget, which is very relevant, that Bill C-234, which is the topic at hand that Mr. Davidson is talking about, was a demand from the Conservatives in order for us to maybe look into it and maybe help pass, but it was not included in there. And I think Mr. Davidson was just making that point.
On that point of order as well. So so
Lawrence.
I'll quickly read this on the sub amendment of which we are debating, that the week of the 28th and future meetings be dedicated to hearing the witnesses for no fewer than 12 hours, and the clerk invite Mr. Carney as a witness to testify with respect to budget 2024, the economy, and the environment, I will grant Mr. Turnbull that the carbon tax has very little to do with the environment, but it certainly is hurting our economy, and so it's completely within scope.
Thank you, MP Lawrence. So MP Davidson, yeah, just try and stay focused to sub-amendment and relevance, please, and you may continue.
No, well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, I thank my colleague for the intervention from Whitby. I think that is part of the problem, and that's what I'm trying to explain to the room, is so that he understands the carbon tax, and that the PBO has said, you know, 8 out of 10 Canadians don't receive back more. And, you know, the Prime Minister and my Liberal colleagues here love to say that. And you know what, Mr. Chair, even if we stretched, and I hate to use the word untruthful, but we'll stretch. What about the 2? They always say the 8 out of 10, Mr. Chair. You know, I reflect on, you know, what our Canadian forces say. We leave no one behind. There should never be an 8 out of 10. There should always be a 10 out of 10. And I'm trying to explain to my colleagues that, you know, with the rural top up, again, talking about affordability now for my residents and standing up for my residents, the carbon tax is basically just a pool of money. It's like an Amway scam almost, Mr. Chair, but we'll look at it like that. It is a single pool of money. And, you know, York Simcoe, I feel, could technically send a bill to the federal government for the rural top-up that we haven't received. You know, that would probably be north of $40 million that my residents should have received. And why does the government not want to recognize the rural top-up for York Simcoe? Because that means everyone else will get less. I'm a conservative riding this big blue dot in the middle of York Simcoe, and if they were to give me the rural top-up, Mr. Chair, that means that everyone else in this room would get less. And I think if we looked at 2, 3, 4, speaking about the economy and the environment, the carbon tax pool, I believe, is heavily subsidized by farmers. And I've seen the bills in my community. You know, the northern end of the riding, Mr. Chair, we bring a lot of grain in for drying. On propane, other farmers coming into York Simcoe to dry their grain. And again, in the Soup and Salad Bowl of Canada, drying onions. This is something that has to be done. But I want my colleagues to understand, we are starting to see more and more onions now coming in from Morocco, from Egypt, from different parts of the world. And why does that matter to Canadians? Because it's about food security. For things growing here, we are starting to see less and less, Mr. Chair. You know, because of the affordability, because of inflation, margins for farmers have shrunk so much. Canada is losing that competitive edge because now there's onions coming in being imported because those margins, we can't compete internationally now. We can't do it. And that is so unfortunate to see. So, again, for the people of York Simcoe, we look at the rural top-up, not getting it. The Housing Accelerator Fund. Not one town in the Northern Six got any money, Mr. Chair. Aged infrastructure. When we see money, taxpayer money here going out to the Asian Infrastructure Bank and not being spent here on our infrastructure. Can't get natural gas lines, Mr. Chair. Aged infrastructure again with hydro. I have farmers that want to create businesses, start small canning operations. They can't even get phase 3 power. So when my colleagues here sit in the House and wonder why people in York Simcoe say this government is not listening and people are frustrated, this is why they're frustrated, Mr. Chair. Just to start with those things. And now, the government will talk about, we're doing this, we're doing that, we've got free dental care for everyone and pharmacare. I would challenge any member of this committee to come with me for a day. And again, this is about standing up for your residents. Come with me for the day. You know what people in my riding are saying? I'd love a family doctor, Scott. Think about the government programs that have come from this government right now. They can't even manage immigration. They can't even manage immigration. And it's another program and another program and another program and another program. And things are getting worse. People in my riding can't even get a family doctor. So before we have all these other programs, and again, Mr. Chair, as shocking again as it is, and I know my colleagues here, they like to blame everybody else for the situation that's everyone's in. They'll first tell you Canadians have never had it so good, that we have AAA credit rating, even though you can't put AAA credit rating on a hot dog. I think we all know that. Tell that to the millions of people that are going to food banks. Millions. But again, they'll say we've never had it so good. So I think this is why it's important to understand, Mr. Chair. We don't even have a hospital. Again, to technology, my colleague from Whitby, Google from Georgina Island to go visit a loved one at a hospital, the only hospital outside the riding of York Simcoe at Southlake. 23 hours to walk there. And this Liberal government will try and square the circle and say, yeah, you know what, Scott, you're part of Toronto. This is where my residents of York Simcoe get very upset. To be classified as Toronto, quite frankly, ripped off on something that they're entitled to. After all, we know that this is a big bait and switch with the carbon tax. It's their money that they're owed, Mr. Chair. It's not the government giving them money. You actually took money from them that you owe them. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that on recap here today, talking about why things are not working for the people of York Simcoe. And again, I think the recap is important so people understand that the circle has never been squared for me. I think, the most frustrating part, I think, about being an MP, Mr. Chair, is not being able to help people when you know there's a solution to the problem. And, I went and saw, and believe me, I will never put words in anyone's mouth, Mr. Chair, but I've got to walk through this. I did speak with the Minister of Natural Resources about the rural top-up. He agreed that there is a problem with the CMAs, but he said, Scott, you're going to have to go and see the Minister for Rural Affairs. That was done out east. So I went back to that announcement, Mr. Chair, and I think this was even more shocking for me. The Liberal government, dividing and gaslighting Canadians based on geography was, I looked at their announcement out east on the heat pumps. And I was shocked all of a sudden at that announcement that the Minister of Housing's riding the member from Avalon, whose ridings were supposed to become urban under the CMA. Mr. Chair, this is going to shock you. At that announcement, they announced the doubling of the rural top-up, but it's, you know, I always say in life, read the fine print. They actually rolled those CMA data back to 2015, so those Liberal ridings would receive the rural top-up.
That's not good.
Again, Mr. Chair, talk about on the outside looking in. So I want my colleagues to understand when I go and see people in Pefferlaw, and Pefferlaw is a great little town. When I go and see people in Pefferlaw, how would you like me to explain to them how the whole island of Prince Edward Island all of a sudden became rural? Downtown Charlottetown gets the rural top-up. Think about that, Mr. Chair. Downtown Charlottetown now gets the rural top-up. Ridings in Halifax and Nova Scotia get the rural top-up because this government has rolled the CMA data back for those. But I've got to stand in Pefferlaw. I've got to take a ferry and go over to Georgina Island First Nations and explain to those people why they don't get the rural top-up. You know, and I reflect on downtown Charlottetown, you know, the amenities, the transit that they have, we have none of that. And again, I've asked my colleagues to circle the square. But again, I went and saw the Minister of Rural Affairs. And she said, Scott, I know there's a problem with that. I know there's a problem with that, but I really don't know what to do. You should go see the Minister of Industry, because the CMAs were apparently controlled by industry. I went and saw the minister and he said, I know there's a problem, but you know what? You're going to have to go see the Minister of Finance. So think about this. I've had 3 discussions with 3 different ministers. They realize there's a problem. I spoke to the Minister of the Environment. I know, Scott. How do we fix it? And shockingly enough, I've written 2 letters to the Minister of Finance on this issue. Mr. Chair, do you think I received a response? Like, think about that, representing over 120,000 people, which I'm honored to do. One individual has written the Minister of Finance twice on this issue. Not even an acknowledgement. Nothing. Crickets. So we have 3 ministers that know there's an issue. And I know my colleagues across the way, I know this to be, and again, I'll never put words in anyone's mouth, that you have MPs representing ridings in Ontario in the same situation as me. And, you know, this is, again, what frustrates myself and frustrates Canadian, is that we're here to deliver results for our communities and for our colleagues to understand the issues that are facing our communities. But this government is not listening. I know I have colleagues across from me, Mr. Chair, that do listen and do understand. But the powers that be are not changing things. And it's making life more and more unaffordable for people in my community. So I again, Mr. Chair, it's important for me to recap. You know, again, a budgetary item, again, back to the economy. I know we're going to have carbon tax Carney. It's carbon tax Carney we're asking for. Wanting to come, you know, I talk about we were looking in the budget for the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund. We didn't see it. We haven't seen it. And, quite frankly, Mr. Chair, after 9 years, that's why we say this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, because he's not worth the cost to the residents of York Simcoe. So just again, so my colleagues can have a recap on where we're at in York Simcoe. No rural top-up. No Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund after 9 years, after the promise was made by, again, the Deputy Prime Minister, that has not acknowledged any letters that I've sent her about the rural top-up. Aging infrastructure. Absolutely zero housing accelerator funds. Zero. I actually get concerned about, York Region being represented by Liberal MPs and the Northern Six as part of York Region getting zero funds. I'm not sure how, I'm not sure how the member for Newmarket Aurora is going to square this circle with the mayor of Aurora. But no housing funds, aging infrastructure, number of residents on propane that would love to go to natural gas, aged hydro infrastructure. Mr. Chair, again, no family doctors, but let's get 4 other government programs going and tell Canadians how they've never had it so good. This is just not the reality. This is not the reality facing the people of York Simcoe. And, I hope that my colleagues across from me understand. I'd love to have a sidebar and I'm sure the member from Whitby or Vaughan Woodbridge is going to explain to me how Pefferlaw really is Toronto. But, it's like I said, Mr. Chair, it's almost, we're too Toronto to get the rural top-up, but not Toronto enough for any housing accelerator funds. I'm not a mayor. I would never tell a mayor what to do, but I would say, Mr. Chair, that Toronto got, I believe, and I know the member from Vaughan Woodbridge crunches numbers, and he may know the number. Because I don't know this exact number. I think it was $560 million. $560 million in housing accelerator funds the city of Toronto got. If I was the mayor of the town of Georgina, I would definitely pick up the phone and ask Mayor Chow where Georgina's cut of that is. Because we got absolutely nothing, Mr. Chair. Zero. It wouldn't take the scum off rice pudding. Nothing. So I think everyone understands here now how my residents, what we're faced with on just those few topics. We have no federal buildings, no federal lands, zero in York Simcoe, no federal offices, and it's getting more and more frustrating for the people of York Simcoe. So, Mr. Chair, I think at the end of the day, I've got this issue out. I think it's important for all members here to understand the disconnect now between rural and urban and how frustrating it is. And I will yield my time to the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South. I was going to say Peterborough only. A great town. They used to build great motors there. OMC, Mr. Chair. It was unbelievable when Canada actually built things and we invested in things. And, You know, I know they're gonna tell us about the battery plants. I'd still like to know where our seat on the board is. I haven't seen that, and how many shares we have. Did we get a seat on the board and shares in those companies with the 60 billion in investment? We could have bought the whole Ford Motor Company for cheaper, but we'll let them go on about that. It was great to be here, Mr. Chair. You're always smiling as usual, and it's all good.
Okay, thank you, MP Davidson. I've got on the list, I've got MP Lawrence, then MP Morantz, then MP Helen. Oh, and then MP Sorbar, did you want on the list? Did you? I can't.
No.
I'd love to hear Francisco. Come on.
MP Lawrence, MP
If you want to
Morantz,
interrupt me at
MP
any
Helen.
time, it's all good. Huh? We'll give you a liberal interpretation of.
MP Lawrence.
Yes, I'm going to start. Just wanted to. Sorry, I was just going to. If you could actually, I apologize if you probably get it quicker than I can, Mr. Chair, Mr. Clerk, the sub amendment for that we're on today.
On the sub amendment. Yes.
Could you read it into the record for me?
Well, you've had the sub amendment, so you got it last night.
I just want to head off any potential relevance calls. So I wouldn't mind it if we could read that into the
Well,
record.
you could look
there.
to it. Yeah.
Sorry.
You could look to the sub amendment. Yes, MP Lawrence.
So you won't read it for me, Mr. Chair?
I believe you can read MP Lawrence.
We've reached this level, have we, Mr. Chair? Look at that. This is not very friendly, Mr. Chair.
MP Lawrence, clerk, if MP Lawrence doesn't have it, you could just send it to him so that he would have it. Yeah. MP Lawrence, the clerk, I think has forwarded that sub amendment to you.
Okay,
so, yeah.
perfect. All right, then I will grab it up and read it here. I'm just like I said, I'm just trying to be a little bit more efficient here. Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. I see we have it here. Okay, that the week of the 28th and future meetings be dedicated to hearing from witnesses for no fewer than 12 hours, and the clerk invite Mr. Mark Carney as a witness to testify with respect to Budget 2024, the economy and the environment for no fewer than 2 hours. So just to head off any points of order for relevance earlier, I will be discussing the economy at some length, and of course that's reference, which also has, of course, direct relevance to Budget 224. So before we do point order, maybe the members or the chair could just read that over, and from that you'll quickly see that I am within relevance. I do want to say to the interpreters, and I believe they've been given a copy of this, at least electronically, that I will be reading from this. If they're not, my staff will be happy to provide it to the clerk again. It'll be from the CD Howe commentary number 625, Decapitalization, Weak Business Investment Threatens Canadian Prosperity. And I hold it up not as a prop, but just to show the interpreters there. And so if they're having any struggles, I see waving of hands. I see waving of hands. If my staff could kindly make sure that you have it. You'll have it shortly. I will give a little preamble before.
Order, MP somebody.
Oui, c'est ça, en lien avec ce que dit.
With respect to what my colleague was saying, the interpreters have not received that document. And so I imagine that time will be provided to the interpreters to receive that document.
For a minute. and thank you for assisting the interpreters so they do have that information.
Thank you very much. And I will start shortly into the text, and I'll give you the exact place that we'll start. I just want to also just read this in French as well, the sub-amendment that we're currently on, just once again to avoid any point de règlement. Que la semaine
That the week of the 28th and future meetings be dedicated to hearing from witnesses for no fewer than 12 hours, and the clerk invite Mr. Mark Carney as a witness to testify with respect to the budget 2024, the economy and the environment, for no fewer than 2 hours.
Merci. J'essaie.
Thank you. I try very hard.
So we're going to start at page 2. I'm going to skip the bold text here. We'll start, the first word will be current dollar. So what I'll be reading from for the benefit of the folks at home is a report from the C.D. Howe Institute. Decapitalization, weak business investment threatens Canadian prosperity. I'll be reading excerpts of it and then pertaining that back to the economy. These are things that, of course, we've asked Mr. Carney to appear upon and to potentially discuss with our committee. So here we go. Current dollar GDP is approaching its historic growth rate in expansions, but real output has responded far less. There's a figure in the report, which I won't go to, but it shows 2-year growth rates of 4 quarter averages, highlights the contrast. Nominal spending, the blue line, has been growing at a rate similar to past periods of expansion since the 1990s. By contrast, real activity, the orange line, is still in negative territory. Prices are rising rapidly. Real incomes are not. Among the likely reasons for the disappointing performance, one highlighted by the Bank of Canada itself, is weak business investment and a consequent slow growth in Canada's productive capacity. So that's really the nub of the issue when we talk about the Canadian economy. One of the challenges that we face is a poor productivity, and as I've talked about before, and John Manley, Bill Morneau, David Dodge, Tiff Macklin, Carolyn Rogers, amongst other experts, have talked about the same, that Canada's slow growth in productivity continues to hurt our economy significantly. So, as I said, prices are, I'm going back to the text now, prices are rising rapidly, real incomes are not. Among the likely reasons for this disappointing performance, one highlighted by the Bank of Canada itself, is weak business investment and consequent slow growth in Canada's productive capacity. Weak business investment is not just a short-term concern. A country's stock of non-residential buildings, engineering infrastructure, machinery and equipment, and intellectual property products is critical to generate output and incomes. But Canada's capital stock is barely growing and not keeping pace with the workforce. New business investment per worker is declining. So pause there again. And so the best analogy I have heard on that is we can imagine we sort of, as is often useful, we use an example that pushes sort of the bounds in terms of reasonableness to the extremes. And so you can imagine a world where we have a Canadian worker, even if the best worker in the world, would be challenged if, in fact, he was competing against a workers from somewhere else in the world, to make it real simple, the competition was to dig a hole, and the Canadian worker has been given a shovel, and the foreign worker has been given a backhoe. no matter how diligent that individual is at digging a foundation or a hole in Canada, no matter how capable, no matter how trained, no matter how hard they are working, they simply will not be able to compete with the individual that has a backhoe. And that, of course, is at the extremes, but I think it pretty well exemplifies the problem of a lack of investment in capital stock in Canadian machinery and equipment. So we'll continue on. Not only have areas of traditional strength in Canadian business investment, non-residential and engineering structures fallen in recent years, but the categories most associated with innovation and future productivity, machinery and equipment, and intellectual property, are weaker yet. And so we've heard some very compelling evidence and comments from important institutions like the Canadian Council of Innovators, amongst others, that of the critical importance of investing in intellectual property. In fact, I tend to agree with a lot of the commentary and experts who say that those who own the intellectual property will own the future. As the 20th century was about owning machinery and equipment and factories, the 21st century will be about owning the rights to designs, to software, to microchips, to the intellectual property innovation as the pace of change continues to grow exponentially. And so it's really challenging, and that's really the issue is not just the current day impact. The issue will be what we will see from 10, 15, 20, 40, 50, even 100 years from now. Our inability to capture on what I believe are the greatest ideas in the world, produced by the greatest workers and the greatest minds in the world here in Canada, and turn those ideas from just that, an idea, a dream, and turn them into a marketable product or service. And the Canadian economy has struggled, and quite frankly, there is very little in the budget, if anything, that will be there to resolve this significant glaring problem. And this is something that folks from the left, right, center have all commented on, and they're all in near unanimous agreement that this government has not done enough in order to protect our intellectual property, which I said are being generated by the greatest minds in Canada. But we need to do two things. One, we need to allow them to the individuals, the companies, allow them to feel at home, feel comfortable here in Canada to build their business. And secondly, we need to capture the IP right here in Canada and make sure it stays here in Canada. Because unfortunately, what is happening is we are producing some of the greatest ideas in the world here. And those ideas, though, before Canadians are able to benefit from them, are exported around the world, of course, most notably to Silicon Valley, in California, in the United States. And those ideas are then turned into marketable products and services, of which they are sold back to Canadians at a premium. We'll continue reading on from paragraph, on the second half of the page, the same page. High or low levels of capital and productivity tend to go together. Businesses invest more when productivity grows because rising productivity creates opportunities for profits as well as competitive threats. More business investment boosts productivity more because it gives workers newer, better tools with which to work. The link between investment in capital on one side and productivity on the other make recent figures on Canada's capital stock, capital, and a new investment worrying. So just to clarify, once again, I'm breaking from the text. What the author is pointing to here is you can have a positive spiral or a negative spiral. And so if, in fact, you are investing in equipment, what will happen is that your profit will increase, which will then embolden the business owner to make more investments into their equipment, and that virtuous circle continues. As more profit is generated, more investment happens, and so on and so forth, and it becomes very, very productive. And so it's actually relatively small changes at the beginning that get that what in Good to Great they refer to as the flywheel. When you're starting particularly when you're starting a business or you're starting to get to scale in a business, it's tiny little pushes over and over again. That means even a small rub in, for example, the carbon tax, which I've referred to in the past as the sand in the gears of the Canadian economy, can actually, even if the impact isn't huge, can be enough to stop a business from being successful or expanding to that scope. Because even the most profitable businesses like Metro Grocery Store, which of course is lobbied for by the leader of the NDP, his profit range is still 4.6%, which is more than Loblaws, but is still a relatively small amount. And so when you push on the carbon tax, what happens is there are some industries like Metro that have an oligopoly that can push that over, but many small businesses especially can't do that. They don't have the benefit of having a lobbyist who's the brother of the leader of the NDP. And so what happens to them is they never get to that expansion. They never get to that level. And so what happens on the other hand is that you actually get the opposite. You get a negative spiral or a death spiral, one might refer for a business. So if in fact the business is obstructed by red tape, by taxation, by the carbon tax, even this is the critical part here, even relatively small because most small businesses are not overly profitable. A successful business may have a profit margin of 10 or 15%. And so if we have a carbon tax that's adding a third of inflation, or a carbon tax that's adding tens of thousands of dollars to a farmer's operation, that can be more than enough than to stop a business from being able to invest in the productivity, to generate the profits they need, to invest more into the capital stock in their business. And so what happens is businesses that we'll never know about have been killed by this carbon tax, and that is impacting our productivity every day. The carbon tax is the sand in the gears of the economy that is driving us to lower and lower productivity. And as I've said numerous times, who gets hurt the most? It's not the Trudeaus of the world who have trust funds who can move their monies offshore. They'll find a way to avoid paying taxes. It's a small business owner struggling to get by, the one who's working 20 hours a day, 100 hours a week, just trying to get their business off the ground. And they didn't need that little bit of lift. And when you put that sand that is the carbon tax in the gears, you cause people to give up, lose hope, and go to food banks, which we've seen. We'll continue on reading there for the interpreters. I'm going to go down to the next paragraph. Whatever is depressing business investment in Canada seems unusually severe. The United States and other countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in brackets OECD, are investing at higher rates. Business investment per available Canadian worker was approaching comparable U.S. and OECD measures from the early 2000s to the mid-2010s. I'm now switching pages to page 3, but it sagged after mid-decade and plummeted during the pandemic. To the extent that Canada's weak performance reflects perceptions of limited opportunities or little need for higher investment by business leaders, public policy can and should help. First and foremost, it can do so by addressing policies that are hurting investment. Government consumption and transfers are crowding out private saving and non-residential investments. Concerns about unsustainable debt and rising taxes undermine confidence. I'm just going to reread that line because I think it's important. Concerns about unsustainable debt and rising taxes undermine confidence. Regulations currently in place and expansive but uncertain plans for more, notably affecting energy production and use, are making Canada appear hostile to private investment. Canada's workers need changes of direction, particularly at the federal level, to get more of the tools they need to thrive and compete. So, what the author refers to there is that there's two different levels of that. So there's the actual policy and the technical impact on the economy, and so there are rational calculations made by business owners and workers alike, deciding if I do this, this will be the consequence. Should I do that or not? And so when we put more costs, whether they are the form of taxes or regulation or otherwise, or even just uncertainty in the market, there's a calculation that goes on and goes, well, you know what, if I'm only going to make 1% or I'm going to make a negative return on this investment, I'm not going to do it. That's what rational actors do, and that's how the Adam Smith's invisible hand works, is the fact that we have millions of Canadian consumers, of Canadian business owners making these calculations every day, these innumerable calculations which aid in the efficiency of the market. And certainly we've seen over the last 9 years that everything has gotten more expensive and everything has gotten less efficient. The result is that business owners don't see the return that they did 9 years ago, and so they are less likely to make that investment. And as I said, it's not just that short-term investment. These things have momentum. They spiral one way or the other. You can have a positive spiral or a negative spiral. So one negative decision multiplies across the economy. One positive decision multiplies across the economy. But on top of that, and this is what Philip Cross has talked about at some length at this committee and other places, is there's also an attitudinal direction. And so when the government is openly critical of business owners, calling small business owners, for example, tax cheats, it has an attitudinal impact on Canadians and Canadian business owners. Because when you are looking at embarking on a business, especially if you're starting a new venture, you're not just looking at today's dollars and cents. You're looking at, is this something I want to do? Anyone who's ever operated or owned a business knows it can be absolutely all-consuming, pushing people beyond their very limits, working sometimes 20 hours a day just to get the venture, just to keep pushing on that flywheel, to get it to eventually its own momentum where it can start running on its own side. There's in addition to all the dollars and cents and those calculations that certainly will take place, there's also, is this something like I want to do? Is this something that society says that culturally that yes, this is something that people appreciate? Because a business owner is really, it's an individual, it's a woman, it's a man, it's a newcomer that has something, that has an incredible gift that they want to bring into the world. And this incredible gift that they want to bring into the world, they want to know that this gift will be recognized, will be celebrated, and will be supported. And so when you hear our leaders demonizing business owners, demonizing those who dare to be successful, who dare to be prospective, it has an impact on folks. It can not have an impact on people. I certainly, whenever I have the opportunity to talk to business owners, the first thing I say is thank you, because it's their actions, their gifts. It's their, sometimes they've given up decades of their lives in order to bring this gift to the world, and to make sure that it is successful and to improve the world. And I know certainly, like, it doesn't just even stop with whatever their service is. I know in my little town of Orono, our hockey teams, our soccer teams, our charitable service, they all would not exist without the incredible efforts of our business owners who, in addition to working their 10 or 15 or more hours a day, then give back to the community on weekends. through fundraisers and through efforts like that. And just a quick shout out to one of those industries, Cameco, which of course has a facility in Port Hope and is headquartered out of Saskatchewan and is producing clean nuclear energy through their production of uranium pucks and other products related to the New York and to the nuclear industry. Donated $500,000 worth of check for $500,000 for youth hubs in coordination with the provincial government and our MPP David Piccini. So $500,000 in addition to providing clean, carbon-free energy for all Canadians and really around the world. And so this is an example of great business owners providing jobs, opportunity, and then going above and beyond and donating $500,000 to make sure the youth in Port Hope have a place to go. In addition, they provide it with if they want, if they're having any type of mental health issues. And this is just a private initiative of a great citizen of Cameco. But I'll return back to our text here, and we're on, for the interpreter's benefit, once again on page 3. I'm going to continue under the subtitle, The Numbers, and we'll read from there. The capital they use on the job is critical to workers. Ability to produce goods and services, earn incomes, and compete internationally. Human capital and natural capital, like land and water, are intuitively important, but we do not yet have good measures of either, and very little that we can compare internationally. Capital created and owned by government also matters, but the services it yields are harder to relate to production and income, and also hard to compare internationally. We do have a robust measures of built capital in the business sector, non-residential buildings and engineering structures and manufacturing and equipment and IPP, or intellectual property. These complement human and natural capital and government infrastructure in producing goods and services and generating incomes. For a snapshot of the correlation between capital stock on one hand and incomes and output on the other, then it talks about figure 2, which I apologize you guys can't see, but I would direct you to, I believe all these reports are publicly available, which compares 2022 OECD estimates for both divided by labor force in each country. Can I get a thumbs up from the interpreters if I'm reading? Speed is good? Yes, slow? Okay. Figure 2, the link between per worker measures of productive capital stock and output for Canada and other OECD countries with comparable data. The stock of productive capital consists of physical assets like structures and machineries to be used as an input in production. To get this measure, the cumulative sum of past investment volumes are adjusted for the age and efficiency loss. That is, the older the asset is, it is less likely to be productive than a newer one due to wear and tear. A high stock of productive capital means that the capital stock is more efficient, a better complement to labor inputs, and embodies more recent technology. It is not a surprise that figure 2 shows that countries with high productive capital stocks also have high levels of output, otherwise known as productivity. Figure 2 highlights per worker measures. Labor productivity rather than total or multi-factor productivity, and capital stock rather than output per unit and labor are considered together. Ideally, we would attribute output quantities and qualities of labor and capital, as well as other factors such as organization of firms, and be able to explain changes in output with reference to changes in various inputs. Such definitive attributions are not possible at present. However, especially for international comparisons, what is clear is that countries with high labor productivity also have high total productivity. That makes sense. Capital stock and incomes are related, are correlated for complementary reasons. Next page there, page 5. Higher productivity creates opportunities and competitive threats for businesses. Those incent investment, which increases the quantity and quality of capital stock. A larger, newer capital stock raises productivity. A virtuous circle for workers who enjoy higher incomes as a result. I'll read that again. I think that's incredibly important. Those incent investments, which increases the quantity and quality of capital stock. A larger, newer capital stock raises productivity in a virtuous circle for workers who enjoy higher incomes as a result. So when we talk about productivity, I think it's incredibly important that we connect it back to how it affects real people. When we enhance productivity per worker, we increase real wages per worker. The correlation is almost perfect. And the reality is that certainly there are debates that can be had in the House of Commons, in boardrooms, and in living rooms and on Main Street as to how we divide up the spoils of ever-increasing productivity. And those are virtuous arguments to have. But the reality is, if in fact we are in the death spiral as opposed to a virtuous circle, the reality is that there are simply no spoils to divide, and that who will end up taking the worst and the brunt of this is, of course, our most vulnerable, our workers, those individuals that don't have the control that the ultra wealthy have. And so when we don't invest in productivity, when we don't give the freedom of the market to work, we don't allow for an efficient marketplace, it is the most vulnerable who hurt. And this is what happens time after time when socialist policies are put in place. I mentioned yesterday the examples of India, Israel, and the UK. Of course, there are always a myriad of factors, and so it's very difficult to get a perfect correlation in anything in the economy because there are so many variables. But it jumps off the page, the connection between socialist policies and a decline in productivity and a decline in competitiveness, which all relates into a decline of workers. Which, I mean, the irony can't be lost that often we have socialist parties like that of the NDP Liberal government who swing to power saying that they are going to help the middle class and those aspiring to join the middle class, and they have done nothing but through their poor economic mismanagement but crush those very people. The inequality in Canada has been growing considerably over the last 9 years. We have record food bank usage. Our workers have never been in the last 50 years in a worse economic position, facing GDP per capita and living standards that continue to decline relative to many of our peer nations, including most notably the United States of America. So, but we'll continue on, and I'll start with figure 3, which shows real stocks of each type of capital per member of Canada's labour force. The fact that capital formation is both the result of productivity growth and the driver of it makes recent trends in those stocks troubling. The stock of non-residential capital relative to labor force peaked in the last quarter of 2015. By the first quarter of 2022, every type of capital was below that peak. Wow. Only engineering construction did not decline shortly after 2015. It continued to grow through 2021, and its stock per available worker was down comparatively small 1% by the first quarter of 2022. So that speaks to a couple things, because I do earnestly try to be an advocate for the truth. So it's not as if the Liberal policies could have immediately kicked in 2015. These things have they take a while to get into place. Whether some policies are quicker than others, tax policies may, as is potentially happening with budget, you may get a fire sale because of some of the policies. But generally, economic policies of a government, they're big ships economies, and so they take a little while to turn. And it's not as if the policies immediately Prime Minister Trudeau and this NDP Liberal government get in power, and it has this impact of slowing the economy. But what it did do is it signaled to business that Canada was no longer a place where people wanted to do business, and that's that would be my thesis there as to why it's rare actually that you see the type of dramatic reduction or improvement almost immediately upon a government getting elected, and that's really what we see. Whether we look at GDP per capita, productivity, investment, I mean, you name the economic measure, you can any line graph, you can see it. We're going streamingly along till underneath Stephen Harper, and even we're on a trend line. I might say even with Chrétien and Martin, that's not that far. But Harper really gears it up, and then unfortunately, like in 2015, it drops, right? And rarely do you see I know Mr. Sabera is well schooled with respect to economics, for example, and so he would understand that you don't really see that type of correlation because there are so many variables in the economy, and so when you see that, it really jumps off the page. But it would be my supposition it's not only the economic policies of this government that have been woefully negligent and devastating for the economy, but it's also the attitudinal direction, particularly with respect to Canadian energy. So just to give you an idea, so GDP per hour is how we measure the productivity, and most economists measure the economy. In Canada, we're floating somewhere around $50 per hour contributed to GDP. In Canadian energy, it's about 500. And you know what? I've actually asked, and of course, I've asked this of a number of witnesses, mostly of either environmentalists or left-wing NDP Liberal witnesses. As the chair knows, I make it a policy to ask questions not just of Conservative witnesses, but of all witnesses. And what I've asked them for is, if anyone out there is watching this and they know the number, please forward it on to the Finance Committee or to my email at philip.lawrence@parle.gc.ca. What is the GDP per capita in the green industry? And that's I have a sincere interest in knowing what that number is, and no one's been able to find that number for me. There's certainly lots of talk of the fact that green energy business will be able to produce or replace other sectors of the economy, but I've not seen that, and I'm open to the argument and even to the fact that government to start a new industry subsidize it. I don't think that those are necessarily bad things, but I'd love for someone to show me the actual economic case behind some of these investments.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair? Just a point of information to my colleague. If the viewers listening to this have the information, they'll be able to send it to his email. But I would like to remind him that the Library of Parliament does offer exceptional service to all members. And so I'm sure that if he were to request the information, he would get it within a few weeks. Thank you.
See, MP.
Thank you very much, MP Sainte-Marie.
I have actually asked him, but I will ask again. I think that's a great point, sir. C'est très bien point.
Very good point.
to find it, and so I will ask the library, and I'll keep everyone updated too. Who knows how long I'll have the floor? So maybe in a couple of weeks I'll still have the floor, and we can give an update going forward there. Okay, but thank you very much for that point. I'll continue. I'll continue on reading. Okay, so we'll start here at the stock. I know I'm repeating, but just to make sure that we don't miss anything here. The stock of non-residential capital investment to labor force peaked in the last quarter of 2015. By the first quarter of 2022, every type of capital was below peak. Only engineering construction did not begin to decline shortly after 2015. It continued to grow through 2021, and its stock per available worker was down a comparatively small 1% by the first quarter of 2022. The stock of non-residential buildings per available worker fell between 2015 and 2020 before growing in 2021. The stocks of intellectual property and machinery and equipment per worker have been falling quite steadily since 2014. I'll just pause there too for a second. So there is an interaction between government spending and capital stocks as well. Although, as the authors point out, it's far less clear than private investment. But like as any Keynesian would tell you, generally, if there's expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, which there certainly has been over the last 9 years, we've seen record deficits, record debts. One would actually expect productivity to increase, simply because the government is making substantial investments. They're in effect mortgaging the future for these. And so because they're spending these dollars, one, you would expect actually at least a small uptick in productivity and in capital investment, right? Because the government is taking resources from the private sector and actually taking them from future generations through borrowing and employing them into the economy. And in fact, that's absolutely essential that happens, because otherwise you are shortchanging future generations, because we're spending this money but not getting any return back. And in fact, I was at Port Hope High School, and I said, and I told them, you know what? Here's the reality, guys. We have a debt of $1.4 trillion. The reality is, given my likely lifespan, is that I will not be paying back a large portion of this debt in my life, but you guys will, and eventually this will come to a head. And so, anytime you talk to any politician, I would highly recommend that you ask about climate change, because I think it's important to have an environment. But the second question I would ask of nearly every politician would be, how are you going to pay down this debt so we don't get stuck with it? Because that's exactly what's going on right now. The declines in stock of manufacturing equipment and intellectual property per member of workforce are particularly worrisome. Past research has identified machinery and equipment investment as particularly important for productivity growth. The author cites several articles there. Intellectual property investment is a plausible indicator of Canada's likely future performance in a world where intangible capital is increasingly important. Whatever special messages the recent machinery and equipment and intellectual property numbers may convey, the messages from stocks of business capital overall is clear. The average member of Canada's labor force began 2022 with less capital to work with than he had in 2015. And you know, the interesting part is that while certainly it's not apparent to me that our Liberal Party elites get that, and even some of the folks that might be some bold on Bay Street seem to have figured that. They haven't seemed to figure that out. But you know who gets that? You know who gets that? is the workers on the factory floor. Go to a factory nearly anywhere in your community and bring up Pierre Poilievre. And I guarantee you will get an incredible amount of support. You could do the same and actually mention Justin Trudeau, but you might want to have some earmuffs on or something because some of the language you'll hear will likely not be appropriate. They get it. They realize they get it, whether intuitively or they've done the research and reading themselves, is that they are not being invested for. They are not being taken care of. They are not being dealt with fairly by this government, which is resulting in lower levels of investment and productivity. Oligopolies are getting wealthy. Some businesses are doing all right, but workers are getting the short end of the stick, and they realize it. And the most embarrassed, I would be embarrassed actually if I was a New Democratic Party member, because they're supposed to stand up for the workers. And it's not just a fluke. It's not just because the leader of the official opposition is a great communicator, which he is. It's because there's a truth that's being revealed that the NDP and the Liberals don't care about Canadian workers, because if they did, they would immediately start putting in policies, procedures, tax policies that ramped up capital investment, so that our workers were given a fair deal. Because they can't earn the wages that they should earn without proper amounts of capital investment. And our government, our federal government, is failing. These Liberals are failing to put in place the policies. And for the NDP to sign on to this it's embarrassing to their legacy. It truly is. And I try not to speak that strongly, especially about my colleagues. I know that their hearts are all in the right place, but the reality is that the most vulnerable are going to food banks. Canadian workers are getting the short end of the stick. And I'll just use unparliamentary language, and they want to do a point of order, they can. Canadian workers are being screwed. I'll continue reading on. We would like to compare Canada's capital stock numbers over longer periods against comparable numbers.
Point of order,
abroad.
Chair.
Point of order, MP Sarbar.
If the honourable colleague would love to yield the floor to me, I would more gladly take over, and I could explain to him and the folks on the opposition side how Canadian workers are way ahead under our plan and how we are moving the economy forward here, not only in Ontario, but across the Canada. So if you'd love to yield the floor, I'd love to take over.
I
Point of order, Chair.
Yeah,
granted bad.
So I've got MP Lawrence. You may continue. After that, I do have MP Morantz and then MP Hallen.
Chair, I have a point of order, though.
Point of order, PS Turnbull.
Standing Order 18 is about order and decorum. I note that the member used offensive words and language, and I would just ask him to retract that statement. Thanks.
Thank you, PS Turnbull. I apologize. I did not
I'll just
hear
withdraw.
it. So if you want to withdraw those, okay.
No
They've been withdrawn. Thank you, MP Lawrence.
No problem. We would like to compare Canada's capital stock numbers over longer periods and against comparable numbers abroad. These particular numbers, however, exist in Canada only since 2009 and are not available for many countries. Comparisons over longer periods and with other reasons. My apologies. I read the wrong page. And with other countries are easier using a related flow measure, gross business investment. Figure 4 shows the Canadian numbers for these three types of investments tracked by Statistics Canada and most other statistical agencies: non-residential structures, both buildings and engineering, manufacturing and equipment, and intellectual property products since 1990. Absent any changes in estimated depreciation and write-offs for existing capital changes in gross investment should line up with inflections in net capital stock. As the net stock figures would lead us to expect The gross investment figures show relative strength in non-residential structures before mid-decade, along with weaker performance in manufacturing and equipment and intellectual property. During the second part of the 2010s, which I assume the author refers to 2015, interesting language, but okay, investment in structures and manufacturing equipment per member of the workforce declined, and investment in intellectual property flatlined. So I'll read that again. That's incredibly compelling. During the second part of the 2010s, investment in structures and manufacturing equipment per member of the workforce declined, and investment in intellectual personal property flatlined. In 2021, notwithstanding a modest rise in non-residential structures and M&E investment from quarter to quarter, a rise sadly not evident in IPP, or intellectual property, the starting point for the year was so low that per available worker investment in 2021 dollars in Canada was only about 11,900. This is down 1 quarter from its peak of 16,000 in 2014. So that's amazing, eh? So the starting point for the year was so low, in 2021 was only 11,900, and that's down from $16,000, barely above 2009 at 11,300. So basically, our investment per worker has flatlined in intellectual property since 2009. Like, pretty soon we'll have members who were elected in 2009 in the House of Commons. Who were born in 2009, sorry. We're going to move to the next subsection here. Apologize for hitting the microphone there. Canada's performance against competitors abroad. The growing importance of intangible assets and the declining materials intensity of economic activity generally might mean that the warning signals and weak standard measures of capital formation are less alarming than they would have been in the past. These trends have affected many countries. So we look now to see Canada's experience compares with that of the United States and other OECD countries with comparable data. Those are shown in Figure 2. Is a capital investment trending similar elsewhere, or does Canada appear to be on a path towards relatively higher capital intensity, implying relatively higher productivity and wages, or towards lower capital intensity, implying relatively lower productivity and wages? So the author then has a subtitle, Canada versus the United States. Because Canada and the United States collect similar capital investment data, and because Statistics Canada takes particular care to compare Canadian to U.S. prices, we can measure investment per worker in the two countries with some confidence that we are getting meaningful numbers. We convert the different types of capital investment into Canadian dollars using Statistics Canada's measures of relative capital to equipment price levels to adjust for different purchasing power differences in the two countries. Investment goods tend to be less expensive in the United States than in Canada. So using the exchange rate alone in converting the U.S. to Canadian dollars would understate the relative bang U.S. companies get per investment buck. Our adjustment provides a better idea of bang per buck on structures, manufacturing equipment, and intellectual property products on either side of the border. The results of these calculations are seen in Figure 5, panels A through D. Canada has an edge in investment in structures, panel A. Canadian businesses, with their relatively greater focus on natural resources, tend to invest in more workers' per. Oh, See, this is one of the things that's really hurting the productivity, and that's sort of one of the untold stories. Is so, Canada has traditionally invested heavily in natural resources. In fact, it was one of the areas where we are most efficient and effective. And both this government's technical and attitudinal changes from the Harper government gravely impacted that. And so, in many ways, Canadian energy is the golden goose that keeps the Canadian economy rolling, is the truth. And people will deny that up and down, but that is the reality. If you look at the numbers, the Canadian economy would have a significant challenge without Canadian energy and Canadian natural resources. The gap narrowed sharply after 2014 with lower oil prices and a policy environment in Canada more hostile to natural resource industries. True. However, it widened somewhat in 2021 with the rebound of Canadians' non-residential structures in 2021, coinciding with a slackening of pace in the United States. The comparison in manufacturing and equipment investment, Panel B, is much less favorable to Canada. While the measure is at an all-time high in the U.S., investment has been flat in Canada since 2009. I actually will just pause from the text there and tell you I'm sorry there. Je m'excuse, monsieur. I'll get back to the text. I actually had an individual come to our constituency office on an unrelated matter to his business, but he'd been brought over from Europe to head up a manufacturing business in our riding. And he was very surprised, I think is clear to say, at the it's not a word, the lack of investment, I guess you would say, in newer equipment, and doing a similar business in Europe. The business which he came from to take over the plant here in Canada was the business was using equipment that was 20 or 30 years newer, and he was fortunate that, like me, he wasn't the youngest man in the world, and so he'd actually used some of this equipment very early in his career, but was really surprised. And unfortunately, I think that is the case, and too often that Canadian workers are being undermined by not being given the appropriate tools. Of course, there's the old adage of sharpening your saw. That if you spend the time to invest in your tools, if you spend the time to maintain your tools, you'll be able to be more efficient and more effective. Okay, and then we'll continue on. The comparison in manufacturing and equipment is much less favorable to Canada. While the measure is at an all-time high in U.S., investment has been flat in Canada since 2009. U.S. businesses typically spend more per worker on such investment, and the gap has widened over the past decade. The gap in 2021 was 6,300. The intellectual property gap is worse yet. Since the mid-2000s, Canadian businesses spending on these products has been in a narrow range of about $2,000 per worker, while the U.S. figure has risen from around $3,000 to more than $8,000. Some of this difference reflects slumping exploration expenditures by Canada's struggling resource sector. To the extent this growing gap reflects greater use by Canadian businesses of information technology owned abroad, its implications for productivity are ambiguous. Reliance on foreign-owned equipment or foreign-owned technology might be simply a smart business decision, or it might reflect Canada's lack of competitiveness in commercializing its own IP, leading to lower accumulation of IPP by Canadian firms. Looking at three types of investment together in panel D, we see that business investment per available U.S. worker has exceeded that in Canada since the 1990s. The gap narrowed in the countries, the gap narrowed. Jeepers creepers, in the 2000s, but widened after the mid 2010s, and has widened further during the pandemic. The U.S. Recovery from the pandemic has been better than the Canadian recovery. In 2021, business investment per worker rose 9% in the United States versus only 3% in Canada. The gap between gross investment per available worker in the United States and Canada was almost $11,000 in 2021. Such a large amount represents a significant shortening of the replacement and upgrade cycle for a piece of capital equipment such as a truck or an excavator, a major upgrade of health and safety in the working place, or a complete replacement of many offices' entire information and communication technology. Asking how many cents of new investment per available Canadian worker occurs for every dollar of new investment per available U.S. worker yields a summary comparative analysis or measure. In Figure 6, we show our measure of investment in Canada per dollar of its U.S. equivalent in total and in each investment category. Canada's relatively robust rate of structures investment stands out in Figure 6. The surge to the 2013 peak. When available Canadian worker, when each available Canadian worker was getting paid more than $1.60 for every dollar of new structures enjoyed by her or his U.S. counterpart is striking. So is the subsequent decline to less than $1.25 in 2019. In this category, at least, the 2020 and 2021 comparisons are positive for Canada, with the average member of the Canadian workforce receiving $1.35 for every new capital of new capital for every dollar received by average member of U.S. workforce in 2020. Not so in manufacturing and equipment. After improving from fewer than 60 cents around the turn of the century to close to 70 cents around the time of 2008 to 2009, financial crisis and the slump, the amount of manufacturing and equipment investment per member of the Canadian workforce per dollar per member of the U.S. workforce dropped to a dismal, a shocking number, dropped to a dismal 37 cents in 2021. So I'm just going to read that again because I think it's critical. The amount of manufacturing and equipment investment per member of the Canadian workforce per dollar per member of the U.S. workforce dropped to a dismal 37 cents in 2021. This situation with intellectual property products is even worse. A steadily declining trend since the mid-2000s has taken us to the point where the average member of the Canadian workforce in 2021...
So it's past 1. We're suspending, and I'll see everybody next week.